Western intelligence agencies believe Russia is behind two recent attempts to smuggle explosives onto cargo planes and may be targeting planes bound for the U.S. Tom Costello is with us. Tom, this is quite concerning. What have you learned?
It really is. The explosives went off in DHL cargo hubs in Germany and Britain. Had a bomb exploded while the plane was in the air, the head of German domestic intelligence says the plane would likely have crashed. A Western security official tells NBC News it could be a Russian operation to undermine support for Ukraine, and cargo flights to the U.S. and Canada could be targeted.
Last summer, explosions at DHL cargo hubs. They were not accidents, they were not isolated incidents, they were part of what European and American officials described as an expanding campaign of Russian sabotage, including arson in the UK and the Czech Republic, attacks on pipelines and data cables in the Baltic, and tampering with water supplies in Sweden and Finland. Earlier last year, the U.S. also helped Germany interrupt an alleged Russian plot to assassinate an executive at a German arms manufacturer that supplies arms to the Ukrainian military. But those cargo bombs on those DHL planes, even with all that other stuff, when the DHL planes started having bombs on board, U.S. intelligence officials said they were a Russian test run to figure out how those devices could get aboard planes bound for the U.S. And as such, that was a frightening new escalation for American officials. The idea that that sabotage campaign could be coming here. Months later, the New York Times reported that White House officials became, quote, increasingly alarmed by secretly obtained intelligence suggesting Moscow had a far larger plan in mind to bring the war in Ukraine to American shores. President Biden dispatched his national security advisor and the CIA director to send a series of warnings to Putin's top aides. The core of the warning was that if the sabotage campaign led by Russia created mass casualties in the air or on the ground, the U.S. would hold Russia responsible. They didn't specify what that response would be, but they made it clear they would take the shadow war between Washington and Moscow to new levels. So that was last year. A new in-depth study of Russia's sabotage campaign finds that the number of Russian sabotage attacks in Europe nearly tripled between 2023 and last year, after quadrupling the year before that. Reporting on that, here's how the New York Times put it, quote, anger at Russia's sabotage efforts has the potential to influence European reactions to the U.S.-led push for an end to the war in Ukraine. Prime Minister Donald Tusk of Poland noted in a social media post on Monday that Lithuanian officials had confirmed his assessment that Russia was responsible for a series of fires in shopping centers in Warsaw and Vilnius. Mr. Tusk wrote, quote, good to know before negotiations. Such is the nature of this state. The message to countries supporting Ukraine has been that Russia can impose costs and increase them. So we had this very big scare last year with not just this sabotage campaign rapidly escalating in Europe, but it appearing to start to target the United States. Yesterday, we get data that Russian sabotage attacks in Europe quadrupled one year and then tripled the year after that. Well, now today we get this from Reuters. U.S. suspends some efforts to counter Russian sabotage as Trump moves closer to Putin. Quote, several U.S. national security agencies have halted work on a coordinated effort to counter Russian sabotage, disinformation, and cyber attacks, easing pressure on Moscow as the Trump administration pushes Russia to end its war in Ukraine. The effort involved at least 7 national security agencies working with European allies to disrupt plots targeting Europe and the United States. Since Trump took office, much of the work has come to a standstill. Reuters cites 11 current and former officials here. I'll tell you what Reuters, that Reuters did ask the Kremlin what they think about this reporting. Quote, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said the Trump administration was trying to get rid of everything ineffective, corrupt, and implausible. Something he said was, quote, understandable. Joining us now is one of the reporters on that story, Reuters national security correspondent Erin Banko. Ms. Banko, thanks very much for being here and for getting this scoop. I appreciate the chance to talk with you about it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Is the United States pulling back from anti-Russian sabotage efforts Because they don't believe they're happening, or because they believe that the efforts are ineffective? What's the rationale on the U.S. side for cutting back on these efforts?
I would say it's very clear from officials we've spoken to, both in this administration and in the prior administration, that our intelligence, U.S. intelligence, European intelligence, still shows that Russia poses a threat both to the U.S. and to Europe in regard to its hybrid warfare campaign or its sabotage campaign. That threat has not gone away. We've spoken to several very senior intelligence officials about this fact. This intelligence has been circulated as recently as last week here in the U.S. and in Europe. But it's very clear from the conversations we've had over the last month or two that this administration does not view the countering of Russia's hybrid warfare campaign as a priority. This was a very high priority for the prior administration, a program they stood up in 2024 to, across the interagency, track, combat this campaign both in Europe and potentially in the US. And a huge part of that was coordinating with Europe. So that included everything from sharing intelligence to drawing up strategies for trying to counter Russia's campaign. So it was a massive priority for the Biden administration, and something Biden officials briefed Trump officials on right before they left, urging them to continue this program.
The sabotage that Russia has been accused of, their efforts, mostly have been documented in Europe. There is this very worrying case on the record in terms of them targeting parcel bombs that were on planes, potentially to be bound for the United States. What do you understand about the balance of, the balance of how much heavy lifting was being done in this effort by European nations versus by the U.S.? Presumably the Europeans are going to still be trying to counter this stuff because they've been bearing more of the brunt of it. With the U.S. withdrawing, how much harder is their work going to be?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Local law enforcement in many of these countries are leading the way in terms of investigations looking at some of these sabotage acts. But I should note it's not just sabotage acts. It's not just arson attacks we're talking about here. We're talking about everything from arson to influence campaigns and political elections to cyber intrusions. And a huge part of what the U.S. did under Biden was shared critical intelligence on not only the unfolding sabotage plots, but on what was going on in the cyberspace as well. And so what happens when the U.S. pulls back or deprioritizes something like this is that the coordination in terms of intelligence sharing then gets lost. I should note that there's no evidence that sort of the systematic intelligence that gets shared from the U.S. and Europe has ceased, but there was this coordinated effort by the White House, in particular, the National Security Council, the FBI, DHS, where a lot of those conversations were happening. That is no longer. And so when the U.S. pulls back from something like that, you lose a lot of not only the coordination, but the intelligence as well.
Reuters national security correspondent Aaron Banco, thank you very much for this time. I know this is very difficult reporting in this sector of government operations. It's really valuable. Thank you for helping us understand it.
Thanks for having me.
But the Trump administration on day one with Pam Bondi at the Justice Department, they announced they're no longer enforcing the rules against foreign agents. They no longer are going to enforce efforts by Russians to evade sanctions. They announced at the Defense Department that they're standing down cyber command operations against Russia. And now we have this reporting from Reuters that they're no longer going to try to counter Russian sabotage efforts that have included assassination attempts and arson and package bombs targeting the United States originating in Europe. It's all pointing in one direction, right? All right, much more to come tonight. Stay with us.